homeless all over the streets, the country going down in front of our eyes, and our money being stolen from us to give to the military-industrial complex.
McGregor argues that we're actually causing more bloodshed, that without our military assistance to Ukraine, the inevitable Russian victory would have been faster and far less destructive and bloody. And the bottom line is, what the hell do we care where the border is around Donbass? How the heck does that affect? I shouldn't laugh at it because people are dying, but the argument is absurd. How could anybody argue that the border of Donbass affects the national security of the United States? Nobody could argue that with a straight face, unless you're a globalist that wants to get rid of Putin.
Yeah. And again, you know, this has been going on back and forth to Russia for, what, 1,000 years? I mean, you know, what's going on here? Again, what are we doing in Guantanamo? That's not our country.
I mean, that's a very legitimate argument. Bush and Cheney and Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House legal counsel who eventually became the Attorney General of the United States, really thought that they could craft their own brand of justice. They really thought they could lock people up and throw away the key. And the Supreme Court said no. Then they thought they didn't have to follow the Constitution. The Supreme Court said you did. Then they thought they didn't have to obey federal law because torture is a crime under federal law. The Supreme Court said you do have to obey federal law. Wherever the government goes, the Constitution goes with it, George.
No, there's no Constitution anymore. And torture's everywhere. You know, it's, again, you know, your article here really makes it clear. Now, back to the current negotiations, they were initiated by the government because the Department of Defense and Justice, after continual changes of judicial and prosecutorial personnel, now no longer wants to try anyone, particularly those defendants who have been tortured. Tortured. Right. And we're talking about Russia.
Right.
You know, and you McGregor's mentioned this, and I mentioned it too, is that, you know, by sending more military equipment, more armaments, you're just making a bad situation worse.
Correct.
This is from today. U.S. Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, you can't get a more freakier clown than that. A comic book artist couldn't, right? I mean, look at this jerk. You know, a lying little freak. Here, here's a picture of him.
He is not a, he is no Maggie Thatcher. He is not a, that's him.
That's him.
He's not posing for that. That's him.
That's him.
I don't know what.
So he comes out and says that he wants to provide Ukraine with, quote, more lethal military aid. And it goes on to help the country repel the Russian attack. Yep. Admiral Tony Radakin, the Chief of Defense for the UK, was said to have started at the same meeting that the UK was moving toward, quote, a new phase of its support for Ukraine. According to Boris Johnson, he said a defense source told the outlet that Ukraine needs, quote, longer range deep fires, including heavy artillery. And for the U.S. to provide Ukraine with anti-ship missiles and more advanced air defense systems. Johnson promised an additional 6,000 anti-tank and high-explosive missiles to Kiev. Isn't this brilliant?
They want war. And they're agitating for it. I mean, if they assemble all this military equipment at that air base in Poland that's 15 miles from the Ukraine border, what's to prevent Putin's people from bombing that air base before the equipment makes its way into the Ukraine hands? That would actually be a more humanitarian way of fighting the war. But then that brings NATO in.
That's right.
So they are practically daring Putin to attack a NATO country. That's how much they want war.
Yeah, I mean, these are their words. Nobody's talking about peace. And again, let's put this into perspective. What if Russia and China supplied the Iraqis with weapons to defeat the United States and NATO? What if China and Russia just provided the Taliban with more weapons to defeat America and NATO in Afghanistan? What if Russia supplied more, and China, more armaments to stop NATO from destroying Libya? Oh, then it would be terrible. But it's okay for the United States to get involved in somebody else's war that we have no business being involved in, and NATO being involved in it.
Correct. I mean, what if the Russians and the Chinese put 100,000 troops at the New Mexico border because Mexico claims that New Mexico is really part of its own country? I mean, it just shows you how Putin's behavior is not the slaughter, but his political and diplomatic behavior has a rationale behind it that is none of the American government's business.
I agree 100%, because people don't know, the average person doesn't know of again, we wrote about it in detail back in 2014, the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, democratically elected president of the Ukraine, by Victoria Nuland and John May He Rotten Hell McCain, and how NATO, there was not supposed to move, quote, more than 1 inch, according to the records of James Baker under George Bush Sr. And back in February of 1990, there were 16 NATO countries, and now there are 30 right on the Russian border. And you mentioned the Donbass region. They were killing people all along, over some 15,000 Ukrainians were killing the separatist region people, but that doesn't make the news.
No. The government and the media have presented a monolithic, one-sided version of all this, all of which is intended to direct the hatred of the American people to Vladimir Putin to prepare them for war.
And you had also mentioned several weeks ago about how the sanctions were illegal and how they don't work. And now you look at all of these stupid little companies. Oh, now today the news was Heineken's is going to pull out of Russia. How dumb could you be? What difference does it make? Oh, so then I could sell more Russian beer and I have to sell your crap. I mean, this is stupid. This is ignorant. And what it is, it's building the foundation for war, because the hatred of the Russians has now been set. And the people hate Russians regardless of who they are, where they are, and what they are. And this, as you said before, and I want to get your quote proper here, that the drumbeat of war is terrifying you.
It is. And nobody is talking about that. Not even the Pope. Nobody is talking about the terrors of the drumbeat of war and the values of peace.
Yep, the values of peace. And that's Judge Andrew Napolitano, a real justice of peace, a defender of freedom, a man of dignity and respect. Thank you so much for being on. And again, there's no authority out there with the judicial background that you have to talk about these issues. And we need the Constitution and our Bill of Rights restored to us, or else we're going to be living, and that we'll be hearing live that drumbeat of war that's terrifying all of us. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Gerald. All the best.